Welcome, everybody. And again, thank you all for joining us in the middle of a working day. I know it's not so simple, but it is important. And again, thank you to our two wonderful speakers who are giving up a portion of their Friday night traditional dinner. We called our Zoom session today, The Battle for Israeli Democracy and National Perspective. It's an important topic that is being discussed extensively in Israel, and we thought it's also worthy of discussion here in the US for all of us who are concerned about democracy in Israel. So actually, let's get started. I want to be very brief to save as much time as possible for our special guests. And before I introduce them, I wanted to just get out of the way a few housekeeping matters. All of you were admitted on mute, but it's not to shut you off from the conversation. We're inviting you to submit questions on the chat to either speaker, actually. This is going to be a conversation between the two of them. And I will explain in a minute what we'll do with all the questions. The session is being recorded, as it usually is. It will be available on our website, the Boston for Democracy in Israel, which I will enter as soon as I finish speaking, also on the chat. And we'll also send it to all the recording to all the participants and invite you to spread the word. After I introduce the speakers, Amir Tibon will open with a brief statement and present Nimrod with a number of questions related to today's topic. This conversation will go on for about 50 minutes or 45, 50 minutes. And then our speakers have been very, very generous with their time to give us an additional 20 minutes, I was going to say seconds, 20 minutes for direct questions from the audience, which is something we traditionally do, and we find it very useful. But we ask you of two things. One is that you submit those questions in the chat whenever you want during the session. And then when it's time to open it up, you raise an electronic hand. Those questions, I must remind you, have to be 1 or 2 sentences, very, very short, with a question mark at the end. Otherwise, we can't incorporate it in the program, and it's a valuable part of the program. Let me go on with introducing our wonderful speakers. My path crossed both of them actually many years ago when they were each in Boston during different times. But this isn't by any means the reason why we invited them to speak at the Zoom session. We're really honored to have two people who are experts in this field and have really taught so many of us already about the situation and the particular angle of this situation. And I think it's a perspective on the security situation in Israel in the context of the regime coup that we don't often hear, at least here in the US. So let me begin with Major General Nimrod Sheffer, who recently completed a very successful term as the CEO and the president of Israel Aerospace Industry, Tasiya Avirit. Thank you, my husband's helping me out. In his last position in the IDF, after 36 years of service, he served as the head of the planning directorate at the General Staff. General Sheffer has a master's degree in public administration from Harvard University and a bachelor's in geophysics and planetary science from Tel Aviv University. I hope I pronounced that right. He enlisted in the Air Force in 1979 and completed a pilot's course in 1981 as a fighter pilot, and held various positions in the Air Force, including command of 2 fighter squadrons, command of the Air Force Base in Ramon, head of the operations and chief of air staff. And personally, Nimrod lives in Netaf, is married to Chaya, and has 4 children. Lovely children. Amir Tibon is a diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz newspaper, where he covers Israel's foreign relations with an emphasis on U.S.-Israel relationship and diplomacy in the Middle East. He was previously Haaretz U.S. news editor, and from 2017 to 2020, the paper's correspondent in Washington. So during the Trump years, as he just mentioned to us. Lots of experience. Amir's writing on Israel and the Middle East has been published in the Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, Political magazines, and other leading U.S. publications. He lives in Kibbutz Nachal Oz, a small community on the Israel-Gaza border, with his wife and 2 daughters. I'd like to say lovely, but I have not met them yet. But I'm sure they are. So
yes.
take it away, Amir.
And I just hope they're asleep now. Lovely they are, but it's 8:40 p.m. here, and I'm here on the Zoom, so I hope for the sake of Miri, my wife, that the lovely girls are already sleeping in bed. Shula, thank you so much for the introduction. And I want to thank everyone who joined today to listen to our wonderful conversation. And, Nimrod Sheffer is one of the greatest experts that we have here in Israel on national security issues. So he's going to have a lot to say. I want to just devote 5 minutes before we go into the questions with Nimrod to give some kind of a brief overview of where we stand with the judicial legislation here in Israel, so that everyone understands what we're talking about today. So Benjamin Netanyahu's government, now 9 months in office, came in with a very clear program to completely remake the balance of power between the authorities in Israel, dramatically weakening the judicial system in Israel, which in our system of governance is really the only serious check on the power of the government. For American listeners, it's sometimes difficult to understand because your system of checks and balances has many different layers. There are 2 houses of Congress, a presidential veto, Congress can overcome the veto. Then there's the Supreme Court. There are other federal courts and state courts. The 50 different states have their own authorities vis-a-vis the federal government. Your system of checks and balances, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's very thorough. In Israel, for historical reasons, the Supreme Court over the decades emerged as the only real check on the power of the government, because the Knesset, our legislator, and the government act most of the time as one and the same. The government has a majority in the Knesset, it controls all legislation. Something that the government does not want cannot pass the Knesset, and then the Knesset cannot pass legislation that goes against the government most of the time. And so the Supreme Court has been the only real check on the power of the government. And this government wants to significantly weaken the Supreme Court in order to amass much more power in its own hands. So far, the government has been able to achieve 3 main targets in its, I call it assault of the Supreme Court. You can use a more neutral word, campaign, effort. And all of those 3 achievements for the government are about to come before the Supreme Court itself in the next few weeks. I mean, the month of September that started today is going to be one of the most dramatic months in the history of the state of Israel. During this month, we are going to see the Supreme Court debate appeals against 3 actions that the government has already taken that are meant to weaken the judicial system. I'll go very briefly over those 3 issues. One of them is what we call in Israel the incapacitation law. Basically, this is a law that the Knesset passed a few months ago that makes it almost impossible to remove a prime minister from office based on a decision that the prime minister is incapacitated and can no longer fulfill their duties. The only time this actually happened in Israeli history was when Ariel Sharon was prime minister in 2005. He had, actually this is early 2006, he had a series of medical events and was no longer able to function because he was in a coma. And so the Attorney General of Israel announced that he is incapacitated, that he's unable to fulfill his duties as prime minister, and someone else became prime minister. The current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is afraid that at some point the judicial system will announce that he can no longer function as prime minister because of a conflict of interest between his interests as someone who is a criminal defendant facing several corruption trials, and his own government's attempts to weaken the judicial system that is running the trial. Personally, I have to say the chance that the Attorney General or the court would have actually removed Netanyahu from office because of his corruption trials, I believe is very, very, very low. But Netanyahu is known to be a paranoid man, and so he passed a law that says that only a super majority of 90 members of the Knesset out of 120 can decide that the prime minister can no longer fulfill his or her duties. This could open up the door to crazy situations in Israel. We could have, for example, a prime minister who, for health reasons, can no longer function. But if the opposition and the coalition and 90 members of the Knesset together don't agree, this person will remain prime minister even if they are on their deathbed and cannot function. And so there has been an appeal to the Supreme Court to cancel this law. The second issue is what we call the reasonableness standard. This is legislation that the government passed a month and a half ago, basically canceling what we call in Israel the reasonableness standard over governmental decisions. Now, this is a bit complicated, so I just want to very, very briefly explain. The reasonableness standard is a tool that has been used by Israeli courts for decades to rule in all kinds of circumstances. It can be used in issues, for example, of medical cases, if God forbid there was some kind of a problem during a medical procedure and there is now a court case about it, the justices can ask, did the doctor act in a way that was reasonable, looking at the circumstances that was in front of his or her eyes? If there is some kind of even, a construction accident or God forbid some disaster that happens in a building project, again, the work of the engineer or of the person responsible for safety can be viewed through the prism of, was it a reasonable decision based on the information they had in front of their eyes? Today in Israel, after the Knesset passed a law a month and a half ago to cancel the reasonableness standard for government decisions, people like Nimrod and myself and other Israelis who may be watching this today still have to act reasonably if we don't want to pay a price rate in court. If Nimrod and I will have some kind of an accident, God forbid, tomorrow, and it will get to court, definitely the judges will be able to examine our actions based on the reasonableness standard, among other factors. The only body in Israel today that is exempted right now from acting reasonably is the government, because a law was passed basically canceling the ability of the Supreme Court to apply reasonableness over government decisions. And of course, this could lead to extremely unreasonable decisions. One of them, suspected at least, is an attempt by the government to get rid of Israel's Attorney General. The Attorney General is responsible, among other things, right now for running Netanyahu's court cases as part of the prosecution. And the government could try to get rid of her, fire her, something that a month and a half ago would have been deemed extremely unreasonable by the Supreme Court, but that can no longer happen. The third action the government has taken is not legislation, but basically the government has been refusing for 9 months to convene the committee in Israel that is responsible for judicial appointments. This is a committee that selects the judges. We can talk later about how it's composed, what the good parts and bad parts of it. But right now, for nine months now, a single judge has not been appointed in the state of Israel. And actually, that is a problem because there is a lack of judges in different courts in the country. This is causing very, very long delays in the court system. Ordinary citizens are paying the price for it. But the justice minister is refusing to convene the committee in order to take revenge on the judicial system for opposing all of his different legislation to weaken it. As I said, there are court cases against all of these three issues, the two laws that were passed and the executive decision not to appoint new judges. And I believe that if the Supreme Court will rule against the government in one of these cases, not to mention the option that it will rule against the government in all three, there is a high likelihood that this government will refuse to accept the verdict of the court. And at that point, we will enter an unprecedented constitutional crisis in the state of Israel. At the same time, the government is planning to pass, in a month and a half from now, a law that will exempt ultra-Orthodox men in Israel from military service, basically creating a discriminatory law that one part of the population must send its boys and girls at age 18 to serve in the military, and another is completely exempted from it. Again, Nimrod and I could have an hour-long Zoom just on that issue of ultra-Orthodox service in the military, but what I will say is that it's a very sensitive and very delicate and very controversial issue in Israeli society. The combination of these three likely developments, a constitutional crisis, a law-breaking government that refuses to accept a Supreme Court decision, and legislation that ends the concept of the People's Army in Israel by exempting a huge sector of the population from service, all of this has led to an unprecedented crisis within the Israeli military that has national security implications for Israel. And this is the subject that I'm going to discuss today with Nimrod. So I hope this brief introduction put everything in perspective. And Nimrod, turning to you now. The first thing I want to ask you, how is everything that I just described, the controversial legislation, the extremism of the government, the tension over the ultra-Orthodox service issue, the tension over the constitutional crisis, how has all of this been impacting the military? And specifically, I want to ask you to discuss the one element that has made most headlines, which is the crisis within the reserve forces in Israel.
Good evening, Amir. Good afternoon to everybody in the East Coast. Well, I would like to open with a very short statement to try and answer your question. I know the Israeli military for almost 45 years, since 1979. I think that currently the IDF is in the worst position ever. Definitely in those 45 years, I know it closely. And the reason for that, and I'll touch upon the reservists and the reserve issue in a second, the reason for that is completely loss of trust between the military echelon, the people who serve, and the political and leadership of Israel, the political echelon and leadership of Israel. And I think that everybody who's listening to us today understand it very clearly that the first issue that every military unit, every military force, every part of the military forces in every place around the world needs first and before anything else is to trust its leadership, from the very minor leaders, the commanders, all the way up to the highest echelon of the national leadership. And the current situation in Israel, starting 9 months ago, led to what I could say almost completely loss of trust between the echelons, and it's only getting worse. Because if you listen to the speeches of the members of the Knesset turning against the Israeli military, its leaders, the people who served for decades in the Israeli military, you could only say somebody is planning an attack against its own military force. And now the reservists, unlike in the United States and other places, the reservists in Israel play a major role in the forces, not only by numbers. We'll touch the Israeli Air Force, I assume, in a second, not only by numbers, but they play a major role and a vital role in every operation, because they bring along with them all the experience from their past in the service, and their weight in the force is way higher than their numbers in the force. And if you'll ask me specifically about the Air Force, I will answer. But I think that really we are speaking in the midst of a really the worst situation I could not ever dream about. I think, like everybody in Israel.
Quite a statement to start with. And I will ask you in a second specifically about the Air Force, but I want you to try to explain to our crowd the mindset of a person that served in the reserve forces for years and suddenly says no more. I mean, what about the actions of this government and the legislation that it is promoting has caused that effect? I mean, we're talking about thousands of people, right? It's I think it's about 10,000 at this point, at least declaratively, of
Mhm.
men and women who for many years were willing to take off their work clothes and put a uniform in the middle of their life, right? The reserve service a lot of times catches you when you're not ready for it and you get the call and you have to go out there. Take a leave from your work, leave behind your family, a lot of time, young children, and go and risk your life for your country for a few days. Sometimes it's weeks, sometimes a month or more. What makes that a person who was willing to do that for many years again and again, wake up one day and say, I am no longer willing to do it? What has changed under this government that we suddenly see this phenomenon?
Yeah, I think, Amir, it's a great question because many people ask exactly the same question. What happened? And the answer is definitely not in the political realm, and I want to emphasize why. I served the Israeli militaries, basically, and most of the time the Israeli Air Force, for 4 decades. Most of it under right-wing governments, which I could agree or disagree, no matter what. Just on a personal note, I did not vote for Bibi, and he was the prime minister for most of the time I served in the military force. And people are saying, okay, you object his leadership, and the answer is definitely not. So the answer to the question what happened is when people serve in the reserve forces or even in their regular position in the defense forces of Israel, and I believe all over the world, you served first the country, your people. In the United States, definitely, you don't serve the president, you don't swear for the president, you swear for a bigger idea. It's the same in Israel. And when people started feeling 9 months ago that the basic cause for their serving the country, meaning being free people in a free democracy, when that was starting being threatened, people said, okay, first they didn't believe, they couldn't believe it's going there. So they said very, very naively, if that's going to change, we are not going to serve because we are not serving the prime minister. We are not serving the Israeli government. We serve the state of Israel as a free democracy. This was the idea. And now it is so deeply threatened that people say, I cannot serve it, and definitely not under a government who tries to make out of itself limitless government. And I think, Amir, that what you were talking about, the legislation, leads to a unique situation that the Israeli government will have limitless power. Like they will be able to decide everything. And really, most of the Israelis don't want to serve in that kind of government or under that kind of government.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. A lot of times when there are discussions of this legislation, I have talks about it with friends here in Israel and also with friends in the United States. People start to describe about, or talk about the problems that exist in the current makeup of the judicial system in Israel. And I always tell people, personally, I agree there are some problems in the judicial system in Israel that need to be solved. But the question we should be asking ourselves about this legislation is not, does it fix the existing problems? I think it doesn't. The important question is, what will limit the power of the government? And when we look at their plan as it's been presented, as it is being legislated, the answer is really nothing. And I think that's the most scary component, that there will be no limitations on the power of the government. If the government can choose its own judges, and then it can overrule the decisions of the judges, and it can put very strict limitations on what the judges can even discuss, it is basically creating a foundation for having powers with no limits. And what I want to ask you specifically about the Air Force. I mean, we said thousands of people in the reserve forces have said they're no longer showing up for duty because of what the government is doing, and it's having an impact on the entire military. but I think the impact is being felt in a different way in the Israeli Air Force, which is such an important component of our country's defense. Can you elaborate a bit about that?
Yeah, the Israeli Air Force is built differently than any other forces that I know around the world. And the reason is that each one of the squadrons, the operational squadrons of the Israeli Air Force is a combination of regular service officers and reservists, meaning about half of the, let's take, for example, a fighting squadron, half of the pilots are reservists. And it's not equal.
Just to give an idea, these are people that have a job. They can be working high tech. They can be pilots for an airline. They can be in finance. They can be teachers. They can do anything. And then they get a phone call, and they have to immediately report to the squadron.
And even before the phone call, they serve a day a week. Actually, they serve 70, on an average, 70 days annually as active pilots. Wow. Just to be in shape, and it's not equal. The two halves are not equal because the reservists are the higher parts. They are the leaders because they are older, they are more experienced. So half of the squadron's pilots are reservists, and without touching specific numbers, when they won't show, actually the squadron will be close to paralyzed. And the situation now in the Israeli Air Force, some numbers were published so people can get the idea. Actually, and reservists serve as flight instructors. This is the second part. And if you think and consider long-term issues, then the lack of people who can train the young cadets really is starting to show up, and the consequences could be very, very tough. And the other part of the reservist is the command and control center. This is a very delicate point. I want to make sure that people understand it, even if it's, well, I always hesitate before I speak about those issues because they are so delicate. But in the command and control center, somewhere in the center of Israel, most people who sit there during crisis times or operations are reservists who are not flying anymore, but they will sit in the posts for days and weeks and months if needed to, and they will control and command all the Israeli Air Force's operations. When those people don't show up, and many of them aren't currently, so even the capacity of operating is hurt badly, just to be on the safe side. So the two issues are the numbers of pilots, the number of command and control officers, and of course, I think the major point is, from the cockpit perspective, the loss of trust between you as a fighter pilot who sits most of the time alone, probably with your co-pilot in the cockpit, and you have to trust 160%. You have to have this trust in your commanders, in the leadership, in the defense echelon that is above you, that he gives you the right orders, the right coordinates. He knows what he's doing, and he's doing it for the right purpose. And nowadays, this is not the situation in Israel. People will hesitate when they will receive an order from the Israeli government. They will hesitate. It was never the situation before. I never hesitated, even though sometimes I thought that the mission is not the right mission, probably, or it's whatever. I never hesitated, and I never questioned the motivations of the people who send me to those operations.
I remember one of the pilots who spoke about this in the media actually referred to a statement that our finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, a very extreme political figure, made a few months ago, where he basically called to burn a Palestinian village on its inhabitants as response for a terror attack. And the pilot said, I'm afraid that with this government, I will be sent to missions that are of this nature that are against the entire ethos of how we fight.
And just Amir,
and that's actually the loss of trust you're describing here.
Yes, Smotrich said not that it shouldn't be wiped out. It should be done by the Israeli Defense Forces.
Yes.
This was the complete sentence. So now everybody who's listening to us can understand why people are questioning the motivations.
One issue that we've heard a lot in the news here in Israel is the question of preparedness or readiness for war. There is a debate about whether or not we are reaching a point in which, because all of these people are not showing up for reserve duty, whether it's in the Air Force, in the special units, in the intelligence units, in the high-tech units in the military, and also in the infantry and everywhere, at some point the IDF will simply lose its status as being prepared for war if, God forbid, one breaks in the next weeks. How close are we to that red line?
Well, I should be careful answering the question because somebody could listen to us. But talking about readiness, first of all, is the capacity of the people to fulfill their missions during wartime. And specifically for fighter pilots or pilots, wherever, when you don't fly, the number 70 days annually is not just a number. If you don't fly as frequent as at least once a week and more, then you start losing your capacity and qualities of operations. And just think about the fact that it all started 9 months ago, okay? So without getting deeper into that, this is the first reason. The second reason is that the Israeli military now is occupied in so many forces and so much of its capacity in the West Bank. And when you are occupied in the West Bank, because of the terrorism there and the situation there, then you cannot train for war. So if you are doing policing in the West Bank, you cannot train against, let's say, battles in the North Front or against armor armies or something like that. So the two reasons are that people are starting to lose their the capacity and sharpness, and the other reason is that most forces are now in the West Bank and don't train.
This is what happened to Israel before the 2006 war in Lebanon.
That's correct.
We were so busy fighting the second Intifada.
That's correct.
And it's important to explain to our viewers that the 9 months that have passed since this Netanyahu government has taken office have been the most violent period in a long time between Israel and the Palestinians. In these 9 months, we've had more Israelis and Palestinians killed than in the entire year of 2022 under the previous government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. And it's not like the previous year was all quiet. There were also terror attacks during that year. There were also Israeli operations in the West Bank in last year. But in the 9 months that have passed in 2023, all of them under the Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir government, we have already seen more Israelis and more Palestinians killed than in the entire year previously. And that explains Nimrod's comment about the IDF having to expand so many resources into the West Bank instead of training for a future war. Nimrod, I want to ask you a difficult question here. Benjamin Netanyahu has been prime minister for many years. And I have to say, I never voted for him. But also, if you had asked me a few years ago, is he capable of taking action that basically knowingly, I don't want to say deliberately, but knowingly harms the security of the state of Israel? I would have said no. I disagree with the man. I'm a strong critic of his policies. I don't think he will take actions that he knows will hurt the security of the state of Israel. Today, when I see this crisis developing in front of our eyes, and you mentioned the two important pillars of it, the lack of trust of the reservists in the government, the loss of control in the West Bank, a lot of it because of the extremist policies of his coalition partners. And I want to add a third component, the legislation exempting the ultra-Orthodox from military service that causes every secular Jewish mother in this country to ask herself, why am I sending my child to risk his or her life when someone else, another mother gets an exemption, and it creates a very toxic environment. You see these three components, and I have to ask you, where is the prime minister in this question? I mean, he must know and understand the damage that this is causing to national security.
Yeah, the very sad question is that he knows exactly what's going on. He gets daily reports, probably more than that, on every single bit that has to do with the Israeli national security, internal and external. So he knows exactly. I just want to remind you, Amir, that about a month and a half ago, when they had to vote for the reasonableness cause, the chief of staff of the IDF, General Levy, approached him in Jerusalem. He tried to approach the prime minister to personally address him and say, okay, prime minister, this will be the situation after the legislation. And the prime minister didn't allow him in, okay?
He refused to meet him, basically.
He refused to meet him. More than that, 2 months before that, Minister of Defense, Gallant, said on the Israeli TV station, one of them, the legislation will harm the Israeli national security. And then he was fired by Prime Minister Netanyahu because he said the truth. And then the people of Israel took to the streets, and he was unfired. He was brought back.
Netanyahu basically was forced.
So under no circumstances you can say that either one of them, Gallant or the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense or the Prime Minister, do not understand exactly the situation. So to your question, the very sad answer, he knows, but he's moving on. Probably doesn't care. I cannot believe in that, but if I judge him according to his actions and not his speeches, the answer is yes. He knows exactly and moves on.
Yeah, and of course, we have to then take into consideration his own personal motivation. When we talk about this legislation that his government is proposing, I think each element of his coalition has a different interest to promote it. For the ultra-Orthodox, it's about shielding them from the option of the Supreme Court intervening in the military exemption law, because surely when that law is passed, there will be an appeal to the Supreme Court to strike it down as a discriminatory law, which it is. It discriminates between my young brother, who is now a combat officer in the military, and someone else who doesn't even have to recruit, and they are afraid that the court will intervene. Then the far-right component of this coalition, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they don't want the court to intervene in anything that happens in the occupied territories. They want to have the most extreme policies over there, and not have any kind of court intervention on civil rights and human rights issues. But I think for Netanyahu himself, the main motivation is very personal. He wants to, for example, if we look at the Judicial Appointments Committee, if the politicians in Israel, the government gets to choose the judges, he will be able to choose the judges in the Supreme Court that will hear his appeal in a year or two after his current trial gets from whatever is decided in the Jerusalem District Court, whether he retains his innocence or is found guilty, there will be an appeal to the Supreme Court. And you think about him being able to choose the judges.
Yep.
Very, very weird situation. Nimrod, one other question I want to ask you that has to do with your unique understanding of national security issues. Some people in the United States, like AIPAC, for example, have said that this is basically all an internal Israeli issue, and the United States should not get involved. American Jews should not get involved. I have to say I've been critical of that view in my writing. But I want to ask you, does this entire situation, what's happening inside the military, the change in the dynamic between the government and the military in Israel, does this also impact U.S. national security interests in our region and the national security relationship between Israel and the United States?
Yeah, so I would like to reply with a question. And suppose, I want everybody to consider my question. Suppose that the threat to Israel was an external one. suppose that the armies around us would do what they did in 1973 and attack Israel simultaneously from different fronts, and Israel would have been in a great risk. Then the question was, no question, everybody would jump in to support Israel. So the threat now is much higher, but the reason that you ask the question is because we don't get it because it's an internal one. And actually, to my feeling and to many in Israel, hundreds of thousands who are on the streets every day almost, they feel that the threat now, the internal one, that is opposed on us from the Israeli government is actually an existential one. So to reply to your question, Amir, well, I think that everybody that Israel is important to him should do whatever he can to support it, this time for itself, not from external forces, not from enemies, but to support Israel and save it from itself. I think that the interest that Israeli military definitely, but Israel as a whole and the United States share are very evident. Actually, being a democracy in the Middle East, then we share the same values as the United States is definitely not just a statement. It's the reality we lived in 75 years. If I get deeper into the military cooperation, which is very strong, I've been in a very prominent position to judge it for almost 4 years, but even in my service as an Air Force general, I knew it. The relationships are so deep and so meaningful for Israel, definitely. But I think that even for the United States, and when you are speaking to your colleagues in the United States, you understand how important it is for them to understand the situation in the Middle East through the Israeli eyes and to understand the Israeli intel and to understand and be able to share the Israeli cybersecurity efforts and to be able and to understand the Israeli counterterrorism actions and theory and methods. So the cooperation served definitely Israel, but I believe also the United States for so many years. And just try to imagine what all of you, we have more than 100 listeners, what would you do if some giant would attack Israel, or few giants would attack Israel from outside and try to eliminate it? It's the same situation.
It's a very good point. And, you know, it's interesting what you said about the military cooperation, because I know we've reported on this, that several high-ranking American officials, from the Secretary of Defense to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the commander of CENTCOM, have all recently raised questions about the situation within the Israeli military in conversations with their Israeli counterparts, with Defense Minister Gallant and with the head of our military, General Halevi, and they've expressed concern about the possibility that the IDF, which is such a close partner of the United States military, will enter a crisis and lose its preparedness for war. And I think that that's an important point to mention. Nimrod, I think we are very close to opening it up to questions from the audience. I do want to ask you, how many people in the security establishment of Israel, people with your rare and unique experience, who spend decades defending Israel, share your view of this current situation inside the military?
Well, dozens. I'm part in a group, a very unique group, who was assembled just to try and help solving this crisis. We are more than 160 highest ranked officers in the Israeli security systems, in the IDF, in the Mossad, in the Shin Bet, and in the Israeli police. We are all kind of reservists or people who served 3-4 decades, each one of us in his own unique organization. And as a group, we are very concerned. Actually, we speak almost on a daily basis. We try to sign petitions or to appeal to the High Court in Israel. So it's not a wimp or something like that, that they just woke up one day with a kind of craziness. We are all very, very concerned. So 160 in Israel is a huge number, The heads of the organizations, all the second level, the higher officers, to be honest, extremely concerned, Amir. Really.
And I want to ask you about the role that the people who are today inside the system may have to play if we reach the point of the constitutional crisis. If we reach a situation where in a few weeks the Supreme Court hands down a decision eliminating, one of the laws that is in question, or forcing the government's hand to convene the Judicial Appointments Committee without changing its composition, which means that judges will have to be appointed in the existing system that requires consensus between the government, the opposition, the judges, the lawyers' bar, and not just the government choosing whoever they want to be a judge. If the Supreme Court takes one of these steps and the government refuses to accept the authority of the Supreme Court, and again, we will have this unprecedented situation in Israel, what role will the leaders of the current security organizations, the military, the Shin Bet, the police, the Mossad have to play in such a reality, which is frightening, but we have to discuss it?
Yeah, we have to. Until 8 months ago, you couldn't even ask the question.
It's
Nobody
theoretical, I
could.
know, completely
Nobody could
irrelevant.
even raise it in our worst dreams or nightmares. I have no doubt, Amir, that all the four will say we are going to follow the law without hesitations. The chief of police has already said that. I think it's the right moment for the other leaders to express their views. I think it's very important for the Israeli society as a whole, and definitely important for their followers. The chief of staff is questioned by his own officers. What are you going to do? I think it is very important for them to hear it out loud. As I said, I have no doubt that they will follow the Israeli law by all means. But even raising the question is very terrifying. And, well, I don't see any other option, actually. Maybe I'm naive, but I think no. And, well, the crisis will be dramatic, because if the government will order the Israeli Defense Forces to do something, and the law would say differently, and then the chief of staff will say, okay, Mr. Prime Minister or my defense minister, I have to follow the law. Then it's dramatic.
Before we open it up to questions from the audience, and I hope people are sending them in the chat, I've taken a brief look, I see some of them. I have a question for you that takes us into a bigger dimension. Can Israel over time remain the most powerful country in the Middle East? And I think in some aspects, one of the most advanced militarily in the world, without remaining a liberal democracy?
Well, it's a tough question. The answer is very clear. I'll try to answer it through my children's eyes. I have 4, 2 boys and 2 girls. They are all officers in the Israeli Defense Forces. One is still in active service. And if you'll ask them, the answer will be no, which is as sad as anybody can dream and think of. It's the place I've been born in. It was my home for my whole life. My parents came as Holocaust survivors from Europe after the war, just before the inauguration of the State of Israel. And my children were born here. But if you ask, could we be a strong power, not as a liberal democracy, the question is not. Many people will leave, even though it's our only home now. If it's not a free country, many people will leave, and the answer is no. So that's why I think we have no other choice but to fight and win this fight for liberal democracy. We have no other choice. So if not, where are we going to go to? So the answer is no, but we are going to stay a liberal democracy.
I think this is an important point. A lot of people in Israel view this situation as a battle that cannot be lost because the implications are so severe as you just put them, Nimrod. So I think with that we will open it up for questions. I think Michal, you're going to call on people who have raised the question, correct? Then we'll give them. And again, I want to repeat Shula's very important point. A question is 1 or 2 sentences with a question mark at the end. Anything longer than 1 or 2 sentences with a question mark at the end will not be addressed as a question, and Nimrod and I don't promise we will answer it.
So let me just ask the people who do want to ask questions to raise an electronic hand so we can find you easily and try to match it. Electronic, do you know how to do the electronic hand? If not, Michal, maybe you can, there we go, you can identify, but please make it short. And I'm going to take the privilege of just asking a clarifying question of Nimrod. When you said that the heads of the security organizations will follow the law, is what you expect. The law is defined both in the law, the legislation or the decision that's passed by the government, and the law is defined also by what the Supreme Court says about the laws. In other words, the decisions of the Supreme Court. Which law are you actually referring to when you're supposing or counting on the security forces to enforce them?
Yeah, so by the Israeli system, the only institution who's allowed to interpret the law is the court. So there's no question about it. The court is the law. The law is made by the Knesset, of course, but the interpretation of the law is the prerogative of the courts in Israel. So there's no question. If the court said right and the government said left, the right answer by the law is right.
Okay, thank you. That made it very clear. So Michal, do you want to start calling on people? And we are actually going to mute you if you go beyond a couple of sentences. So think hard. Go ahead, Elliot.
Thank you. It may no longer matter much, but were people really surprised by what Netanyahu's government is doing? Or was there no such signal? As recently as the most recent congressional delegation, the message seems to continue to be, don't worry, it's a moderate government. We're not going to do anything radical. And the new leader of the House of Representatives on the Democratic Party seems to have believed him. So what's the truth of this matter? Was everyone on notice, or has everyone really been surprised?
I'll take on this one, if I may. I think this is a very important question. I think some people were not surprised. I have to say that if you were just following the interests of Netanyahu as a criminal defendant and his very extreme or ultra-religious coalition partners, the idea that they would try to weaken the Supreme Court seems almost obvious for 2 reasons. Netanyahu wants to weaken the court system for his own interests, again, his trial. But the religious parties in Israel have been dreaming, when I say religious, I mean the ultra-Orthodox and the far right. There's also moderate religious, but that is a smaller component. But the ultra-Orthodox and the far right have been dreaming about weakening the Supreme Court for decades because they view the court as a liberalizing force in Israeli society. A lot of the things that we as Israelis like to communicate out to the world and that we're very proud of, like the progress that Israel has made on LGBT rights and women's rights and equality for minorities, actually came through landmark Supreme Court decisions and not through Knesset legislation. I wish it was different, but that is the reality. The Supreme Court has led to a lot of this progress that, let's say, AIPAC as an organization will celebrate when it hosts members of Congress and does fundraisers. It will show how Israel is the most LGBT-friendly country in the Middle East, which is absolutely true. And yet, without the Supreme Court that the government is now trying to weaken, none of this would have happened. And as for the visit by the Democratic delegation, to me, and again, this is a personal opinion. I try to make that very clear when I say an opinion versus just explain the facts. I think that visit caused a lot of damage because some of the actions that Netanyahu is doing now in Israel, a future US president, who is also a former US president, may try to do in the United States a year and a half from now. And I believe that if that happens, the statements made by some of the Democrats who visited Netanyahu and basically said this is a non-issue will be used against them by the former and maybe future president. So they also hurt their own party by doing that. And they also weakened President Biden. President Biden has been standing very strong so far against this legislation in Israel from a place of being an avowed Zionist and lover and supporter of the state of Israel for 40 years. And as someone who is an avowed Zionist and supporter of Israel, he said, I cannot support this. And for members of his own party to then go and weaken him and send the opposite message, again, I think it plays into the hands of his opponent in next year's election. So that's all I have to say about that visit.
Cynthia? Go ahead, Cynthia. Unmute. Cynthia, unmute yourself. There we
Yeah,
go.
it's not okay.
Yes?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll do this very concisely. Can you explain about the new rule?
You're muted again.
And we didn't hear the question. Maybe I can pick it up from the chat. Did you send it in the chat as well?
Cynthia, you're muted again and you are frozen. Do you mind sending the question in the chat? Oh, go ahead.
No. Carry on.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, the question is, could you please address the loss in legal protection
I think is this
that people that have served in the military or the other security forces will be exposed to in their travels abroad, given the weakening of the legal system in Israel, especially the International Court of Law?
Thank you.
Nimrod, did you get that?
Yeah. Again, the answer is yes. One of the issues that we are very disturbed about is that Israel will be we lost its status as a judicial system who can judge some people and do it promptly. And the reason is the act of complementarity, I think this is the name, who said that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, will say each country who has a fixed judicial system, we don't mess with. And the situation in Israel after the current legislation may lead to, and according to a lot of analysts and according to a lot of experts in law, said that Israel will not have the defense of this complementarity phrase. And not only the ICC could put Israeli officers in trial, but different countries. So if you are a Palestinian with, let's say, French citizenship, you can apply to criminal court in France against me as a fighter pilot who, according to you, bombed your house one day. And the court in France could put me on trial, on criminal trial in France, without being able to be defended by the Israeli court. So the answer is yes.
No, thank you. So Avi?
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank the speaker for outstanding presentation and for the audience. My question briefly is this. According to foreign press, Israel owns an arsenal of non-conventional weaponry. And if the government is pushed, saying the army is too weak, we have to use this weaponry, who is to prevent the Prime Minister office, who is in charge of all nuclear facilities, from doing it, thereby starting maybe a world crisis? Say, attacking Iran with nuclear weapons. What are the safeguards that we have in place, if any?
Thank you.
Optimistic question, but important one.
Yeah. Well, I'm very hesitant about answering this question. I think it's a scenario that won't happen. The checks and balances in the Israeli system are strong enough.
I want to say something.
I'm sorry for being so brief, but you can drag me to answer a more thorough answer, but I would speak about things I cannot and don't want to speak about. But the checks and balances are strong enough in the state of Israel.
And I want to add something to this question itself. I think the question shows why saying this is all just an internal Israeli issue and Israel's friends abroad should not intervene is, to me, a very naive argument. I mean, if we don't want to even get to a point where this kind of question is discussed, it's important to prevent the relevance of it just by not getting to a situation where we lose the checks and balances that Nimrod says are strong. And that is also an interest of Israel's friends abroad, not to mention everybody who lives here and raises children here and doesn't want a nuclear war in the Middle East.
Yeah, and it's not about, I don't know anything about nuclear war, but the answer was about a major attack on any country or so. So the answer is that, according to my belief, and I know something about it, the risk is controlled.
Go ahead, Becky.
So my question has to do with your leadership and the leadership of so many others. You've mentioned a group of 160 people that have held high roles, Ramatkalim, Shabachim, all kinds of people. And I was lucky enough to serve with one of those people. And I hold that person in tremendous esteem. And I was less active until that person, Moshe Ya'alon, came onto a television episode like this, and he spoke, and I became activated. Are the 160 people, how can you reach each and every one of us that knows you personally and respects you and help us stand up?
Thank you for the question, Becky. Well, as a group, we plan to attend the United States for, I don't want to say a tour. It's not a tour, but we understood we need to speak closely to the people, to be very approachable, and to be among the people. So in Israel, we speak a lot in not almost every weekend. Few of us speak to the people. We are present in the media. You can ask Amir, many of us, even his father, who's one of the leaders of this group. So in Israel, we speak a lot. I think we plan to come, I think next month with a small delegation to the United States to speak to the people and to be able to answer questions. And really, I think it's important. We are not preaching for anything. We preach inside Israel, of course. We are not urging people to do what you don't want to do, but we try to explain how severe is the situation according to our views, and each one of us from his different perspective and experience. And the situation, as we analyze it, is severe, no less than that.
Thank you. Is Steve the next one?
Yeah, my question is more about the courts. And is it correct that in addition to trying to weaken the Supreme Court, there are also bills that are going to try to expand the power of the rabbinic courts? And how would that affect the general population? And will that have also a chilling effect on maintaining Israel as a liberal democracy?
That is a very important question. I should have invited my wife to answer it because she's a social worker and she has a lot of information and is very much aware of what the government is trying to do on that front. Also, while at the same time weakening the regular judicial system, strengthening a parallel system that exists in Israel of rabbinical courts that mostly deal with issues of divorce and family arrangements, and but also basically what the government wants to do is to give them more and more authority. So other issues could also be debated in the parallel track of the rabbinical courts that decide based on religious text. I mean, it's something that is very difficult to explain to American listeners who live in a country where you have separation of religion and state. In Israel, we don't have that separation, and there is this, parallel track of the rabbinical courts. If you're a secular Israeli in today's reality, unless you get divorced, you are not very likely to meet this court system, the rabbinical courts. Of course, if you get divorced, it becomes very ugly because these courts have a very different view of women's place in the world than what is the view of, I think, most people on this conversation. But what the government now is trying to do is to give these courts authority on other issues as well. So just one example, you could have a situation where if there is a family dispute and a social worker intervenes and tries to help one of the sides who is under violence or threat, the other side to the dispute could then sue the social worker before the rabbinical court, and if the social worker is a woman, she won't even be able to testify. I mean, this is very, very complicated, but it is a dangerous thing. And again, the most important question is, will the Supreme Court have the power to intervene in government actions or legislation? Because we know that if the Supreme Court holds that power, crazy ideas like this one will be limited. But if the Supreme Court is stripped of its ability to intervene, or if the government can choose the judges in a way that it knows they are all loyalists and will not choose to intervene, then scenarios like this one become a reality.
Thank you. Go ahead, Margie.
Yes, how do you read President Biden's apparent willingness to meet with Netanyahu this fall? What do you think is his agenda, and how problematic is it for the pro-democracy movement in Israel?
I'll start with an observation. The Minister of Defense Gallant is currently in the United States. He did not meet anyone in Washington. He was not allowed to Washington, which is crazy. And the reason is that Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't visit President Biden yet. So he does not allow his minister to meet their equivalents and partners in the United States to promote issues that need to be addressed. The Minister of Defense, for example, needs on almost a weekly basis to speak to his colleagues in the United States to solve and to deal with actual defense issues every day, and he's not allowed to do so. This is crazy. If you ask Margie my opinion about visiting the United States, I think that President Biden shouldn't invite Netanyahu to Washington, to the White House, until he stops ruining Israel. So this is my opinion. I hope you won't do it. But actually, I'm surprised about the Minister of Defense who obeyed the strange order not to meet his colleagues in Washington. This is about the Israel national defense issues. It's not about being nice to one another. So just to answer directly, I think that the answer is no, we shouldn't invite him. Amir, what's your take about it?
I want to say something about President Biden. President Biden several times already has made very strong statements on this issue. And I think his involvement was very important for the pro-democracy movement in Israel. At the same time, I don't think it's fair to expect President Biden to be the one who saves us from ourselves or something like that. And I think the movement in Israel and the people who support it in the United States, and this is critical, especially in the Jewish community, need to realize that you cannot put all the weight of this issue on the shoulders of the president, okay? There has to be a component also in Congress. If there is no backing from the Democratic Party, from members of Congress, from senators, from governors, mayors, Jewish community leaders who tell President Biden on the issue of Israeli democracy and supporting the democracy movement in Israel and opposing the anti-democratic legislation, we got your back. You're not alone. And nobody will be able to come and say that your opinion is far away from the opinion of the Jewish community. Nobody will be able to say that your opinion doesn't represent the mainstream of the Democratic Party, which is pro-Israel, but pro-democratic Israel. The president needs to know, I think, politically, that he has this kind of support to continue engaging on this issue. And maybe one of the things that happened is that because he came out so forcefully, people said, wow, the president of the United States and such a Zionist president who has supported Israel for so many years has spoken out. This is great that not enough of an emphasis was placed on creating the political environment around him that will keep echoing this message. And I think there is work being done right now by some supporters of the Israeli democracy movement in the United States on that front. There's a resolution in Congress that was presented by Democratic members a few weeks ago, and I think close to 50 have already signed it, 50 Democratic lawmakers in support of the pro-democracy movement in Israel. And I think it's important for anybody who cares about this movement and cares about Israeli democracy, not to just come and say, should Biden meet Netanyahu or not, which is an important question, but what am I doing today and tomorrow to create more support for President Biden to continue speaking up on this issue, so that even if he meets Netanyahu, whether it's at the United Nations or in the White House, he feels comfortable to come and tell him, this is an important issue for us. And we continue to oppose what your government is doing as supporters of Israel. And I'm not speaking just for myself now, but this is something wider. And I think, again, when AIPAC brought that delegation of Democratic members of Congress to Israel, the entire purpose of the trip was to try to create a schism, to try to create a division within the Democratic Party on this issue, and to try to create an impression that Biden doesn't speak for the party. And so if there is more and more support, and here the voice of the Jewish community is critical, because the Jewish community in the United States is the one that sets the boundaries of the conversation and really defines what it means to support and love Israel. The Jewish community comes out, including the legacy and establishment organizations and the important community organizations. I know that now in San Francisco, already we are seeing action at the level of the Jewish Community Relations Council. I know that in Seattle, there is some kind of an effort also with the Federation. We see that in more cities and communities. I think it will give a lot of momentum for the president to continue to engage this issue.
And please note everybody that's online that Proposition 6, link to Proposition 61 has been put in the chat. And if each one of you, 100 people multiplied by 10 people, get 10 other people to sign it, we're get their legislator to sign it. In other words, approach your legislator and get them to sign it, we will have a win. That's the way to get to strengthen Biden. That's the way to strengthen the public opinion. And so check it out in the chat, please, and act on it. David.
Yes, this is a somewhat different type of question. Some of the issues you've described and developments we have seen are very much like those in Hungary and Poland and other such places. But as you made clear, the role of the military in the Israeli case is very different from Hungary or Poland, and much more like Turkey. In some ways, the military is the last redoubt of the secular liberal forces in a political system that's become more conservative, more religious, more populist. Is there possibility of a showdown in the offing? Bibi has already accused the military of trying to override the democratic process, blah, blah, blah. Is there a serious chance here? I don't want to use the word coup, but is there a serious chance here that there will be a real showdown while the military is still a liberal institution, which is less and less the case, but still now is?
I think no. No, but the situation in Israel is getting closer. I'm quoting Thomas Friedman, getting closer to be the situation in Lebanon than in Poland or Hungary, which is way more risky. We are in the Middle East. We are divided religiously. We are divided along different rafts. And the direct answer is no. I think no. I hope not, of course. We won't get there. The Israeli people is strong enough. The Israel democracy is still strong enough. And the fact that there are so many civilians taking to the street every weekend, I think would suggest that the answer is no. There is no chance for that.
I saw a comment someone wrote that not everybody joining here now is from the US. I just want to say what I said earlier, I think is also true for people in other countries where there is a significant Jewish community and that has strong ties to Israel. I've heard friends from the UK, from Australia, from European countries asking, how can we get involved in this? And my answer is always the same on this. So, obviously, I think most important in the United States because of the special relationship, but also in other countries as well.
Absolutely, and we have a certain case in England now that was very successful in turning the organized Jewish community to speak up, and is extremely meaningful. Can I take the privilege of hosting and ask another related question before we end, because I think we're at the end? And this is to you, Nimrod, pretty much. We talked about all sorts of elements on the security issues and the relationship with the US and internal and the reservists and so forth. But I want to ask something about collaboration, cooperation with neighbors and how that's affecting Israel's security and national security. I'm starting with, for example, the policy that's allowing Jewish terror in the Palestinian territories, in the West Bank particularly, creating a backlash of Palestinian terror that's very strong, and a sort of circle of blood, losses of life and insecurity, and on to countries like Jordan and Egypt and the likes that have, and the Palestinians that have long cooperated on security issues on Israel's eastern border. It's been, since the peace treaty, extremely important. And I have friends in all those three countries saying we really are at the edge of not cooperating. I mean, for us, it's just not worth it and we can't take it anymore. And those are very high echelon people who are saying, the people are pushing us and we're holding on, but we're at the edge. That's another element of losing national security if we don't have these collaborations. And I wanted to hear your view on what is it and what can be done about it.
Yeah, first of all, we have the most right-wing government ever, an extreme government, and you see it on a daily basis in the West Bank. You don't have to look under the rocks or in the shadows or in the shades. You see it on a daily basis. The actions of the government promote the extreme right-wing policy. This is first. I personally don't see any difference whatsoever between Jewish terrorism and Palestinian terrorism. A terrorism attack is a terrorism attack, and it meant to harm civilians, and I see no difference. This is one thing. The other issue that you're asking about, Shula, is a cooperation with Egypt and Jordan, which is extremely important for Israeli national defense. Well, the longest border we have is with Jordan, and it is still the quietest, and also with Egypt. So they are both very quiet borders. And if we lose this cooperation with the Egyptians and Jordanians, it's going to be awful for Israel and for its own security. And I think that the relationships between Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world and the Arab nations are strong enough to say, guys, if you are not considering the welfare or the dreams of Palestinians, whatever, you'll feel it in other borders. And this is a risky situation. And the last point about that, Shula, I want to make is about Saudi Arabia. Just want to make a very short notice. If Saudi Arabia will master the circle of uranium enriching, my personal view, that is going to be extremely risky for the whole region, for the whole Middle East, definitely for Israel. But it is very different if you have a nuclear reactor in Saudi Arabia. It's not the same situation as being able to enrich uranium in Saudi Arabia. And I think, I hope we will never face this situation, but this is going to be a very risky situation for the state of Israel and for the Middle East.
So
I
optimistic,
want to-
pessimistic?
Yeah, I hope it's not going to happen. On that point, I'm not pessimistic. I think it's not going to happen.
I want to add just one sentence, Shula, before we wrap it up. I agree with Nimrod. These relationships are so important to us. And this government so far, I think, has managed to cause damage to a lot of the fabric that unites Israeli society. I hope their next step is not to break apart the ties we have with our closest neighbors.
Yalla. So I think on this note, we can only thank you for your really generosity and expertise, sharing your expertise with us. I applaud you, and I want to bid you Shabbat Shalom and all the other good things, and for better times, right?
Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Shabbat
amen.
Shalom.
And when
Thank you, everyone who joined and listened to us.
Thank
and
you.
I hope you take the message with you to others as well.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Shabbat
Shalom.
Shalom ותודה רבה.